Let me start by saying I'm a big fan of Tony Khan. At heart, Tony is a wrestling nerd, just like me, and he's living out the dream that we've all had of running our own wrestling promotion. I really appreciate how AEW has enriched the wrestling landscape over the last few years. It's definitely made the industry a far better place. When AEW first launched, it was a real alternative to WWE. It brought high production values and it presented real superstars like Chris Jericho and Jon Moxley, and it gave wrestlers working in the US another place to ply their trade. This was really important back in 2019 because WWE was terrible back then. It was nearly unwatchable and fans needed an alternative product to enjoy. We were even talking about the possibility of AEW taking over WWE in the ratings and becoming the #1 promotion. But now it's 2024 and the landscape has changed significantly. WWE has completely reversed its fortunes creatively and it's back on top. The product is red hot, they're attracting new fans by the bucket load, and they've just had one of the best WrestleManias in recent history. The way Tony Khan keeps referencing WWE is starting to look pathetic, especially now he and AEW are on the back foot. We can't ignore how poor AEW's attendance levels have been recently, and the fact that their ratings have bottomed out over the last year. And that's partially because a lot of people have gone back to watching WWE, now it's good again, and it's also partially a case of AEW's creative process not being as good as it once was. And this backdrop makes AEW look really inferior when Tony pulls stunts like he did on Dynamite this week. When he announced that he was going to show the security footage from All In at Wembley Stadium, nobody thought this was going to go well. For those unaware of what's happened, CM Punk got into an altercation with Jack Perry after the All In show in London last year. The men already had some ongoing issues with each other and they apparently ended up coming to blows backstage. Depending on whose report you believe, this ranged from either being a heated argument between colleagues or a situation that was so hostile that Tony Khan said that he feared for his life. And they were Tony's own words, by the way. At that time, we could only go off what other people backstage had reported. Of course, this was the straw that broke the camel's back, as Punk had had a number of other problems in the company up until that point. But either way, Tony had decided that enough was enough, and Punk had to go. He'd feared for his life after all, and he didn't want that kind of atmosphere backstage, so fair enough. The belief since has been that Punk had the last laugh because he just walked back into WWE. Nobody ever expected Punk to ever go back to WWE, and in a way, he kind of stuck a middle finger up to Tony in the process. Really, Tony should have moved on from here and never mentioned Punk again. It would have been the professional thing to do. Just before WrestleMania, Punk did an interview with Ariel Helwani and he trashed AEW and Tony Khan. This clearly pissed Tony off, and so he's decided to retaliate. It was announced that on Wednesday's episode of Dynamite, he would include the previously private security footage from the fans on the wrestling forums through to Dave Meltzer. Almost everyone who commented on this decision condemned it immediately as a terrible idea, because what good could possibly come of this? It certainly wasn't going to help get Jack Perry over, because Tony hasn't been using him since the altercation. All that anyone could think was that the footage was going to make Punk look weak. As petty as it would be, this is the only benefit that could come of this if it either proved that Punk was overly aggressive or it proved that he was a little bitch. So they air the footage on Dynamite. And yes, it does show that Punk was the aggressor. He walked up to Perry, shoved him, tried to choke him, and then he threw a punch. Then the men were separated and Punk walked away. If you've seen this footage, you'll know that this all happens incredibly quickly. In seconds, it's over. This kind of altercation happens all the time in men's locker rooms around the world, not just in wrestling, but every sport you can imagine. I'm surprised we don't hear about more physical altercations like this going down backstage at wrestling shows. So why do I say that releasing the footage was a big mistake? Firstly, nobody's going to change their opinion of CM Punk. You either love him or you hate him. Either way, you already know that the man can be a hothead. Secondly, it makes Tony himself look incredibly weak. It's clear from the footage he couldn't control the members of his own locker room, and his previous claim that the situation backstage made him fear for his life sounds totally ridiculous after you've viewed the footage. Thirdly, it makes All Elite Wrestling as a brand look second-rate. Punk left the company months ago. If this is to spike Dynamite's falling ratings, all it's going to prove is that Punk is a massive draw and that Tony was an idiot to release him in the first place. You might say that Punk started all this by trashing Tony on Ariel Helwani's podcast, but can you imagine Triple H responding like this to someone who's bad-mouthed him? But I think Tony Khan needs to reevaluate how he's running his wrestling promotion. Acting like a child and throwing his toys out of the stroller is not a good look for him or his company. Right now, Tony's business is bottoming out in terms of ratings and attendance figures. His energy would be better focused on that, because I'd rather live in a world where AEW still exists and people can be proud to support them.